Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be talking about dispensationalism and covenant theology in our continuing series on hermeneutics. What have been some of the different methods of interpreting the Bible? Well, back in the Old Testament era, they had a tendency to take it at face value. Certainly, there was figurative language at times, poetry, and those things would be taken rather symbolically and figuratively. Um, but they had a promise that God was going to come and set things right, and it was like having a jigsaw puzzle. They had all the pieces, but how it all fit together? Well, they had a number of different theories on what that would look like. And then when Jesus came, you remember that many of the Jews did not accept him because his coming did not line up with their expectation of how those pieces would put together. He fulfilled those Old Testament prophecies, but not necessarily in the way and manner that they had anticipated. And so, there were some people that thought he would be a great high priest, or some people that thought he would be a conquering king. Others had this view or that view, and they were all wrong. um, and when he came, he did fulfill the prophecies, but not in the way that they assumed it would all fit together. In the last 200 years, there has risen a new teaching. It's known as dispensationalism. Came to us compliments of a gentleman by the name of John Nelson Darby back around the 1830s. He had studied law, and then he became a Christian, and subsequently was ordained as an Anglican clergyman. He joined a group that would eventually become known as the Plymouth Brethren. They are rather dear to my heart because in my early years, my wife and I were youth directors in a Brethren church. And so lovely people. But he taught, and they adopted this teaching that the church should have elders and deacons, but no single pastor. And so a plurality of leadership that was demonstrated within those, and they still hold to that distinction even today. Now, he's the one who developed this idea that we're going to talk about, dispensationalism. And so it's defined, I'm quoting from Charles Ryrie. He was a professor at Dallas Seminary. I remember meeting him many, many years ago. He wrote in his book, Dispensationalism Today, and he's quoting Fuller. He says, Fuller says that the basic premise of dispensationalism is two purposes of God expressed in the formation of two peoples who maintain their distinction throughout history. Notice that. God has two peoples that he's working with. He doesn't join them. They maintain their distinction. And notice, classic dispensationalism, according to Ryrie, says, and they maintain that distinction throughout all eternity. Two segregated people, and never the twain shall meet. So the first distinction of dispensationalism involves the plan and purpose of God, that it teaches that God has two separate plans, two separate and distinct peoples through whom he works. And who are those people? Israel and the church. Remember, and according to dispensationalism, never the twain shall meet. When God is working with Israel, he's not working with the church, and vice versa. And so he keeps them separate and distinct. Of course, even dispensationalists agree that there's a sense in which they'll quote Galatians chapter 3 and verse 7, that those who are faith, it's those who are faith who are sons of Abraham. So yes, both sides, both Israel and the church, people are saved by grace through faith, and there's a sense in which we are described as sons of Abraham, but still, that doesn't mean the church becomes Israel or Israel becomes the church, that they are separate and distinct. Secondly, involves the law. Distinction number two, that dispensationalism says that the Mosaic law is done away in Christ completely. The Ten Commandments are not for today. Now, they'll agree that, well, most of them are repeated in the New Testament, but those are instructions given in the New Testament. That's not the law. That's separate and distinct. And then dispensational views on the Sermon on the Mount have a tendency, and we'll come back and talk about that has a tendency to follow suit. That likewise, not only is the law done away in Christ, but any teachings in the New Testament, especially in the Gospels, about the law, that has no relationship to the church, including the Sermon on the Mount. Of course, Jesus says something a little bit different. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 17, do not think I came to abolish the law of the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. And the dispensationalists will say, see, he fulfilled it, and so therefore we're no longer under it because he fulfilled and completed, and so the law in that sense isn't for the people in the church today. Distinction number 3 has to do with the nature of the church. Dispensationalism sees the church as a parenthesis. That is you know how when you're speaking and all of a sudden you make a parenthetical statement, a temporary situation lying between God's two dealings with Israel. So God started off dealing with Israel, and then, as it were, he sort of, imagine you have a stopwatch and you just hit stop on the stopwatch, and he paused with Israel, and he inserted the church as this parenthesis. And then once the church is removed, we'll talk about that aspect in just a minute, then he will start the stopwatch again and continue right where he left off with Israel again. So church and Israel, you can't be dealing with them both at the same time. There's that parenthesis idea. Now, Paul in Ephesians chapter 3, verses 9 and 10 talks about how, notice I'm going to quote, to bring to light what is the administration of the mystery for which for ages has been hidden in God. It doesn't sound like it's a parenthesis that came, but rather something that was already present. And our dispensational friends would say, well, God knew it was coming. Notice it's been hidden in God, who created all things, in order that the manifold wisdom of God might now be made known through the church to the rulers and the authorities in the heavenly places. Is it a parenthesis or a culmination? I'll let the reader decide. But you have two different ways of looking at the church between dispensationalists and non-dispensationalists. Another distinction regards the Old Testament promises. Dispensationalism says that all of the promises given in the Old Testament to Israel must be fulfilled to a political nation of Israel. So that's why God's dealing with the church, or he's dealing with the nation of Israel. If Israel was scattered, it had to be brought back together. In fact, it was brought back together. It's a nation today. 1948, Israel actually became a nation. That's pretty neat. And our dispensational friends said, see, it had to come back together, and now God can continue with the promises to national Israel. Now, you have a slightly different emphasis by Paul in Romans chapter 9, verse 6, where he says, they are not all Israel who are descended from Israel. You can have people that are descended from Israel that, strictly speaking, don't have that spiritual connection to God that Israel was supposed to have. So you have an identity problem that Paul speaks of in Romans chapter 9. Now, in the Old Testament era, you had national Israel, and you always had those that were part of the nation that believed. In fact, the prophets sometimes refer to those as the remnant, where God had called the entire nation, but there were within the nation of Israel people that had broken the covenant, had gone and worshiped pagan gods, and so really, in a sense, well, actually, God is going to, in the Old Testament, through the prophets, uses the analogy of having divorced those people that were unfaithful, divorced his unfaithful bride. But at the same time, there was always that believing remnant. Now, when you come to the New Testament, of course, you still have the nation of Israel there, but then you have those who recognize Jesus as the Messiah, and they are described in the New Testament as a believing remnant. They were, if you look at Pentecost, all the believers, they were all Jewish people. They were all Israelites. The idea of having Gentiles come to Jesus, that really hadn't caught on yet. Remember, God had to give a vision to Peter. Here's how you can understand. Remember, Cornelius comes and God tells Peter 3 times, and Peter's not so sure about that. Lord, are you sure? But then Gentiles begin to come. So at Pentecost you have national Israel with a believing remnant, those who believe in Jesus as the Messiah. Today, you look at things a bit differently. Most of that believing remnant are made of Gentiles. I'm not Jewish, at least insofar as I know. my mother used to remind me, well, her background is from Spain, and there was a whole remnant of Jewish people that lived in Spain. She used to like to think that maybe there was some Jewish ancestry there, and I don't know, I can't say. But most of national Israel today are not, they don't believe in Jesus as the Messiah. So there is some crossover. But the believing remnant, that's become a very big remnant. What we call the church today are made up of both Jews and Gentiles. These days, it's mostly Gentiles. It'd be neat if more Jewish people recognize Jesus as Messiah. And that's my hope and prayer, and I think that would be wonderful. And I've got a number of Jewish friends that are Christians, that are part of what we would call that believing remnant. Now, here another distinction is the idea that there would be two future comings of Christ. Now, in the Old Testament, it just talked about the coming of the Lord, but once he came, Jesus and the apostles talked about how he would come again. So here it is. Dispensationalism teaches that Christ will return to earth in a secret, notice I put in quotes, rapture. It doesn't sound nice to say, well, the second coming of Jesus and then the third coming of Jesus. That just doesn't go over very well. So they've coined a phrase, the rapture. That's the next coming of Jesus, but after that there will be another coming of Jesus, which they refer to as the second coming. So notice that Christ will return to earth in a secret rapture in which all believers will be removed from the earth. And this is later followed by the second coming of Christ, which is a distinct and separate event. So dispensationalism says two future comings of Jesus. Now, this is seen in contrast. Notice I'm putting dispensationalism, and I'm contrasting, and I'm using the term covenant theology, although I haven't talked at all about covenant theology, and I'm not going to in this lecture, because let me just, in this sense, translate covenant theology as non-dispensationalism. That's just too big to fit on the chart, so I took a shortcut. I probably should not have. So think dispensationalism versus whatever isn't dispensationalism. Dispensationalism stresses what they call the literal interpretation of the Bible, and that tends to be very often our default. Nothing wrong with that, but non-dispensationalism, or in this case covenant theology, accepts both literal and figurative, sometimes spiritual, but sometimes types and things like that, interpretations of the Bible. And I think it depends on the context. Dispensationalism, whenever the term Israel is used, they would say it always means only the literal, physical descendants of Jacob. Non-dispensationalists might say that Israel, it depends on the context, that it might mean either the physical descendants of Jacob or the spiritual descendants, that remnant that we talked about, but it depends on the context. Remember how Paul said, not Israel is Israel. Well, that's not a contradiction in terms. It's two different uses of the term. Dispensationalism says that God has two peoples with two separate destinies. Israel is the earthly, and then the church is the heavenly. And non-dispensationalism says that God has one covenant people. Here's that covenant theology term. That those in this age have become part of God's continuing covenant people. That he took the two groups, and I'm borrowing Paul's language from Ephesians chapter 2 and also in chapter 3. He took the two groups and made them into one. He has not kept them segregated. He has integrated all of his believing people. In dispensationalism, it says that all Old Testament prophecies for Israel are only for the physical nation of Israel, not for the church. Covenant theology, and I would just say non-dispensationalism teaches that some Old Testament prophecies are for national Israel. Some are, and some are for that remnant, or what we might call the spiritual Israel, or God's believing people. Again, it depends on the context. Dispensationalism says that the church is a parenthesis in God's program for the ages, whereas covenant theology and non-dispensationalism says that the church is the culmination of God's saving purposes for the ages, that he had promised all the way back to Abraham's day. Through you, I'm going to bless not just the people of Israel, but all the nations of the world. Dispensationalism says that the main heir to Abraham's covenant was Isaac and the literal physical descendants of Israel. I'm going to go with covenant theology here. Says the main heir to Abraham's covenant was Christ. He was the seed, Paul actually says, the promise was not to seeds, plural, but to one seed, that is to Christ. And that literally he is the spiritual Israel. And then we become part of him. We become part of that by joining to him in faith, as do all people who come to him in faith. So dispensationalism sees two future comings of Christ, or actually in some cases three, but I'm not going to get into that right now. Multiple future judgments, so that there's not just a future judgment, but there's a bunch of different judgments with different people coming before Christ to be judged. And then multiple future days of the Lord. When you see the phrase day of the Lord, of course, when we were looking at prophecy, we were talking about how the day of the Lord can be used in a localized sense. The dispensationalists would probably agree with that too. But there's future days of the Lord, where the day of the Lord is when he comes, but also there's another day of the Lord many hundreds of years after that. So multiple future days of the Lord. Now, covenant theology versus dispensationalism. Notice covenant theology, or I would just say non-dispensationalism, looks at the law and says there are applications of that today. Our dispensational friends would say, and they are my friends, dispensational friends would say, that really doesn't apply to us. There may be some similarities, but it doesn't really apply to us. And therefore, when each of these views look at the Sermon on the Mount, covenant theology says, well, no, we can apply that for today. Those are things that we ought to be doing today. Classic dispensationalism says, no, that was, Jesus said those things while he was on earth, but then the church came, and those things do not apply to the church, so therefore leave the church out of that, and we don't try to apply that for today. Now, let me just say, there are some, and I mean in this in a good way, not just in a neutral way. There are some non-consistent dispensationalists, and I'm including in this Dr. John MacArthur. He's a well-known preacher, actually founder of what seminary is it? I started to say Grace, but that's not it. Master's Seminary, and he's a dispensationalist, but he would say, no, you should apply the Sermon on the Mount for today. And so let me just say, if you're going to be a dispensationalist, be a John MacArthur-style dispensationalist. I think that you won't go far wrong, at least with regard to interpreting the Sermon on the Mount. Now, with regard to prophetic fulfillments, remember our dispensationalist says that all of the promises to Israel are literally fulfilled, and I would agree that there are literal fulfillments. You look at Ezekiel chapter 26, prophecy of Tyre, that was very literally fulfilled. You look at Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9, it talks about the Messiah coming riding on a donkey, and Jesus did. Very literally. So there are some, I don't want to dissuade that. There are some literal fulfillments. You look at Psalm 22, verse 18, and then compare that with John 19, verses 23 and 24, where the soldiers divide the garments of Jesus by casting lots for them. That was literally fulfilled. In fact, if I had been reading, and I suspect when our Jewish friends are reading Psalm 22 as a Psalm of David, they're thinking, okay, David went through these things, but not physically, sort of figuratively, and that's, he felt like he was disjointed and things like that. And although there was a time when they probably did cast lots for his clothing. Remember how Absalom comes in and takes all of the possessions, takes Jerusalem and all the possessions of David. But these are all things that were literally fulfilled. But you also have figurative fulfillments in the Old Testament and New Testament, for that matter. Jesus stands in the temple in Jerusalem, and he says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Now, fortunately, John adds in the very next verse that Jesus was speaking of the temple of his body. Otherwise, we'd probably have two different opinions on what Jesus meant. We do know what he meant because John helps us with that and explains that this was speaking of a figurative fulfillment. It wasn't speaking of a literal temple. It was speaking of his body being in the grave and then rising again from the dead. You can also compare Psalm 118, verse 22 with Acts 4:11 and also 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 7. The stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. And in those passages in Acts and 1 Peter, we find out that that's referring to Jesus. We're not talking about a literal rock, a literal stone, but rather he is the stone which the builders rejected. So that's a figurative language, and you do have some of those Old Testament passages fulfilled figuratively. You can also compare Isaiah chapter 22, verse 22, with Revelation chapter 3 and verse 7, where the key is a representation of the authority of Jesus, and talks about this key of David that will be used. That's figurative language to speak of the authority of Jesus. You can also compare Zechariah chapter 13, verse 7 with Matthew 26, verse 31, where strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. And Jesus is the good shepherd who was stricken so that his sheep, not literal sheep, but his followers, his disciples, they were scattered. And finally, we have spiritual fulfillments. So literal, figurative, and spiritual fulfillments, Jeremiah chapter 31. Verses 31 through 34 promises a new covenant with Judah and with Israel. Now, when I get to Hebrews, both in chapter 8 and again in chapter 10, that new covenant is said to be fulfilled in Christ. I would say that that's fulfilled, that we become partakers of the new covenant. Now, there are some dispensationalists, not all of them, but some that will say, no, we're not in the new covenant. That's with Israel. But quite a few dispensationalists would say, no, we have become part of that. That's why we partake of the sign of the new covenant. We eat his bread and drink his blood, not literally, but the bread and the wine. Those are signs of the new covenant, and we can partake of that because we have entered into that. Likewise, Isaiah chapter 2, verses 2 and 3 speak of the mountain of the house of the Lord being established and raised above the hills. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 22 alludes to that passage and shows how this is a picture of people turning to Christ in this age. Now, that's speaking to a Jewish audience, but it's not a Jewish post-Christian or pre-Christian audience. Those are people that are part of what we would call the church, and the writer to the Hebrews calls them the heavenly church, the church of the firstborn. So that speaks of this age. Amos chapter 9, verses 11 and 12 tell how God will raise up the fallen booth of David and wall up its breaches and raise up its ruins and rebuild it in the days of old. Now, James in Acts chapter 15 quotes that passage and says that refers to the Gentiles coming in to the New Testament church, so therefore we ought to let them in. Remember the big issue in Acts chapter 15, should we allow the Gentiles to come in? And James says yes, based upon that Old Testament passage. So even James takes that Old Testament passage and applies it to his day in a figurative sense, not a literal tabernacle of David, but that Jesus was that. Revelation chapter 11 and verse 8 speaks about how the bodies of the two witnesses, and we could talk in a future class about what those might be. I'm not going to get into that right now. But how they will lie in the streets, notice, of the great city, which mystically is called Sodom and Egypt. And you say, what place is that? Where also their Lord was crucified. Now, that sort of pins it down. Here's a place that's called Sodom and Egypt, but it's not Sodom and Egypt, literally. Those are just spiritual designations for Israel, not for Israel, for Jerusalem. Revelation chapter 11, verse 8 points that out. Now, Darby said, and I already alluded to this, that there would be two future comings of Jesus. That there would first be the rapture where Jesus comes for his church, and then after a period of 7 years, a 7-year tribulation, that there would be the second coming where Jesus comes with his church. Now the problem with that is that the New Testament, even in the passages that they claim, for example, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, dispensationalists say, well, that's Jesus coming for his church. But when you read the passage, yes, Jesus comes for his church, but also it continues, for if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep in Jesus. There in that chapter, which is supposed to be a rapture passage, Jesus comes both for his church, but also with his church. He brings with him those who have fallen asleep in Jesus. So the distinctions really don't hold up careful scrutiny as he brings those with him. Now, finally, I want to look at two passages. Matthew chapter 24 is a passage that our dispensational friends say that's the second coming. They'll see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory, and it goes on from there. Whereas we just said, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 is a passage dealing with the rapture. The Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, trumpet of God, the dead in Christ will rise first, and we who are alive will be caught up together. That's supposed to be the rapture there, with them in the clouds. Um, but notice how these two passages, when you put them side by side, that they're really saying very much the same thing. Notice Matthew 24 says they'll see the Son of Man coming, where in 1 Thessalonians 4, the Lord himself will descend. It's still Jesus. He still comes. He whether he's descending or coming. Matthew 24 talks about how he's coming on the clouds of the sky. Notice 1 Thessalonians 4 speaks about he'll gather. They'll be caught up together with him in the clouds. The clouds are mentioned in both cases. In Matthew 24, you have he'll send forth his angels with a great trumpet. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, you see this reference to the trumpet of God sounding. In Matthew 24, they'll gather together, not people to be judged, but his elect. So they'll gather together his people. Notice again, his people will be, we who are alive and remain will be caught up. His people will be caught up together. Notice the together in both places. In Matthew 24, his elect are gathered from the four winds. They're caught up to meet the Lord in the air. So even though you have different terms, they're really synonyms. It almost seems as though Paul goes out of his way to describe the coming of the Lord, the descent from the Lord, as the coming of the Son of Man back in Matthew 24. That it really does look like, and was taken by the church, by and large, for the first 1,800 years of the church. As I said, dispensationalism is a relatively new, it's been around almost 200 years now. But prior to that, you're hard pressed to find anybody that described these two events as being two events. Most Christians just looked at that and said, well, that just looks like a different description of the same thing. And I suspect that they were correct.